Welcome to the Ofrenda. My name is Nicholas Gonzalez. Thanks for coming over. Each episode, we'll get the chance to meet someone new who may not be able to introduce themselves anymore. We'll talk with those who knew them, as well as discuss all of the different topics that arise whenever you pause and take the time to remember people. Today's episode is actually a very special one. We are going to be able to talk with someone who actually has a day-to-day interaction with death and kind of understand their point of view and how they see this whole experience with us. We have Lupe with us today. Hi, Lupe.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Of course. Can you kind of introduce yourself, what it is that you do?
Sure. So, my name is Lupe, and I'm a death doula and end-of-life care specialist. A lot of people might not know what that is, so a brief overview is I handle all the non-medical aspects of death and dying. It can be anything from helping people write, end-of-life care, wills, or advance directives, or it can be actually sitting with people as they die.
Awesome. Can you kind of explain how you got into that? Because it seems like it's something that you don't really hear about day to day.
Sure, yeah, it's kind of a niche market, I've been told, but I was having a lot of trouble understanding and coming to terms with the way that the West deals with death and grief. And so one night, as I was laying awake, as one does, I began to scroll Instagram, and I saw that there was this woman, her name is Elua Arthur, and she was hosting one of the first ever Death Doula certification courses that there, have been. And on a whim, I thought, yeah, that could be something I'm good at. And I applied, and, a couple days later, I had forgotten that I had applied, but I got in. So, yeah, it's kind of been all uphill from there.
Awesome. Yeah, so it seems like you really just kind of found this out of nowhere and kind of dived right in. You said that you felt like you could go into this. What made you think that?
I guess I was at the beginning of my decolonization journey, and it just seemed like a really good way to give back to my community and to make sure that end-of-life care resources were available to people in marginalized communities and people who might not otherwise get help, if they didn't ask for it and advocate for it. So yeah.
So as far as I take it, then you're very involved in your community outside of your job?
I am, yeah. Not necessarily locally, because I live in kind of the middle of nowhere in the boonies over here in Washington State. So a lot of my work has been done online. Along with a good friend of mine, we began a Nawa and Nahuatl learning course, and it's, one of the traditional indigenous languages of Mexico. And we thought that other people might want to, reclaim their identity, reclaim their practices, and just kind of be around community. So we now have over, 2.3 thousand members, and it's a very active and very loving community.
Awesome. So to kind of go into the beginning of what it is, say if you have are they patients or are they people who hire you? How's the connection that you make with people that you work with?
Yeah, so since it's non-medical, I just call them clients. And my clients reach out to me a couple of different ways. I get some referrals from hospices in the area. I get some referrals through this organization that I'm a board member of. It's called A Sacred Passing. And I also get referrals through another collective that I'm a part of. It's called the Pearl Collective. And from there, we all kind of reach out, to each other when we see a client who has a specific need or, someone who we think can benefit from our individual skills. A lot of my work is word of mouth, and, I've been getting more referrals from Instagram of all places lately, but it really does kind of, pay homage to the modern world that we're living in, the way that I'm getting these referrals and the way that people are reaching out. It's very interesting, because when I first went into this work, everyone said, oh, you're going to have to be out there with your business cards and, really advocating for yourself. But I've been very lucky to have people come to me and to be in the right place at the right time to help people.
So then when you have a client either referred to you or they seek you out, what's kind of the process that you guys have?
Right. So every client kind of has their own specific needs, and depending on what they need, I do an initial intake appointment, and that one can range from about 90 minutes to 2 hours, just so I can really get a feel for what they need. And from there, we devise a plan together. If it's someone who is given a terminal diagnosis, we devise a plan of, okay, what is it that you need in order to wrap up your affairs and to feel the best you can by the time that you die. And if it's someone who has experienced a loss and is just kind of wanting to work through grief, I do the same process, intake appointment, and then we decide what the best course of action is for dealing with grief and for tying up the loose ends that the dead person might have left. I also work with some different organizations, and I kind of do like grief mentoring. And from there, same thing, 90-minute appointment. And then we schedule a couple meetings, 2 weeks after, 3 weeks after, a month, things like that, until I feel confident that they have been given the tools and the ability to really look at their grief through a different lens and heal from it in a way that maybe traditional Western culture doesn't necessarily allow us to do so.
Gotcha. Well, that's interesting then. So it's not always just dealing with the person necessarily that's going through and dying, but more so also including other people who may perhaps in the past have had someone and are still going through and dealing with some of the residual, I guess, emotions, correct?
Absolutely, yeah.
I guess I'm curious, is there anything that kind of drew you to this idea of seeing death in a positive way? Was there anything that kind of sparked either your interest or made you rethink kind of what in the Western culture, the way that we view death?
Yeah, I guess I saw the way that, my friends grieved their loss as Americans, and I as, an indigenous Mexican American. It really didn't make much sense to me. Everything seemed so medicalized and so sterile and so disconnected. And it just didn't, I couldn't understand it. And so in my desire to understand it, I sort of began to fall in love with the idea of helping people through their grief and through their death and through all that stuff. I also had a family member of mine die in, America, away from our traditional culture and away from our traditional burial practices. And so it was very eye-opening to see how things just were not working and how the funeral industry has really monetized death in a way that is sort of unprecedented and people don't really think about. And I just thought there has to be a better way to do this, and there has to be a better way than to just tell people to move on. It's not something that we can move on from, but death and grief is something that we move forward with.
No, that's an interesting way to put it, because there is this overall feeling, especially in the US and Western culture, where if someone passes away or if someone's dealing with something, you're kind of just told, just keep going forward, don't stop, don't slow down, don't think about it too much, and kind of move on to the next thing, instead of actually taking what it is that's happening to you and carrying that with you later on so that you can grow with it instead of just leaving it behind.
Exactly, yeah. And, there's a lot to be said about the efficiency of American culture and of Western culture. Things get done quickly, they get done kind of unceremoniously, and you're sort of expected to be a whole person all the time and be your best self all the time. But how can you do that if you haven't had the opportunity to feel what it's like to be a person, to have the real emotions and to have the heaviness and to have the humanity extended to you, to say, if you need some time, take it. Clearly, you're going through something.
Yeah, it seems like especially in American culture, it's almost looked down on to take the time. It's kind of one of those things where it's expected to you to just keep going and going and going. And if you are dealing with something, they give you a little bit of time. There's always that little bit of expected time. But if anyone needs additional support, or if they need more time to deal with a certain thing, it's kind of seen as a negative rather than something that they can use later on and grow from.
Exactly.
So can you explain in your own words kind of what it is that how your culture sees death differently?
Sure, yeah. It's kind of a difficult question because, a lot of the elders in Mexican communities, they've been sort of really indoctrinated with Catholicism and a lot of that, the religious aspects of death and mortality and what comes after and what came before. But there is still those little hints of ancient traditions, Dia de Muertos, Day of the Dead. We still have that. And we have, the novenarios, the way that we grieve for our dead 9 days after they die. And I saw the little bits of who we once were in those old traditions. And I really wanted to find the root of that and the heart of that, because our culture, even in Mexico, is really grieving right now with everything that's going on politically and with all the death that we're seeing just on a daily basis. The murder of women, the murder of, not necessarily murder, but I would call it the abandonment of the elders in our community with this pandemic. And just, there was so much there that didn't make sense to me when we had all these rich traditions. And so I kind of started to look past it, look beyond the surface, and I found the most beautiful and the most rich way of life and way of grieving and way of seeing the world. And that really helped me understand how we went, from point A to point J or whatever that we're at now, and how to dismantle some of those toxic ideas that we were given during colonization, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, because there are things that I, growing up, remember seeing that a lot of my relatives would do in Mexico, where, especially during Dia de los Muertos, they would always have the photos of everyone on the ofrendas. There would be the Catrinas, all of the skull candy and everything placed, and how it was viewed more of a celebration rather than, this dark, deep thing that no one really talks about.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that it really does touch on the way that our ancestors used to view life as just one continuous celebratory event. There was not really any part of life that wasn't worth remembering and wasn't worth honoring. Birth and death they're so similar in the way that they're so finite and that they're so life-changing and life-altering. And the celebrations of, the papel picado and the music and the food and the aromas of the cempasúchil flower really kind of plays with our heartstrings in a way that makes us see it fondly. And like you said, years and years later, we remember it and we love it and we treasure those memories, even if it is a day about, people dying.
Yeah, definitely. So then I guess now, because you work in Washington State, correct?
I do.
Yeah. So it's pretty far from Mexico. So how do you find, I guess, a way to connect with your culture and bring that over with people who are there? And I guess in addition to that, do you only work with indigenous people, or do you try to include others into kind of your field?
Yeah. So since it's a two-part question, I'll answer it, in two parts. But I work with anybody who needs the help. I don't really discriminate against, anybody. That's the main foundation of my work. But I do try to work with, like I said, more marginalized communities. And unfortunately, because of the way that America's set up and because of racism and because of, hundreds of years of those mentalities, I do often work more with BIPOC people and with, the LGBTQ community and people of, lower income. And so that you rarely see, white people of means reaching out to me and saying, I need help with this, because they have the resources. But because of the work that I'm doing with all these marginalized communities, they all kind of are a little bit more open to the idea of a good death and a warm death versus like a scary and, ending kind of thing. These are people who have seen suffering up close and who have known it since they were children and who have, kind of had those memories of sadness and of death permanently instilled in them. And so they're all really eager for this opportunity to see it differently.
If you feel comfortable sharing, is there any client that you remember fondly or any experience with client that you feel comfortable sharing with others?
Yeah, so...
And you don't have to share names if that's really fine.
Of course, yeah. No, we like to keep our clients' privacy, but it's sort of a difficult question because I remember most of my clients very fondly. There are some when I was first starting out that I didn't really know how to instill boundaries and I didn't know how to demand respect for myself, that I was like, that was a learning lesson. That was a choice. But there have been clients who, I work a lot with wounded warriors and I work a lot with veterans, and it might not necessarily be fond, the memories, but, they kind of see me as this last-ditch effort to absolve themselves of their, heaviest memories and of their sins, one could say. And sometimes they tell me things that are really intense, and sometimes they tell me things that they've been hiding for years and that have been eating them up with guilt. But there's always that look of release and relief at the end that I think makes the job worthwhile. It's nice to know that you were able to provide a last sort of comfort and a last human kindness for people who have otherwise been suffering for years and years and years and years.
You mentioned earlier about trying to set up boundaries. Is that simply because of the nature of your work, or?
Yeah, with something so emotional and with something that's so deeply personal, I realized that if I didn't figure out how to not let how do I put it? There's a saying in Spanish that comes to mind, but I don't quite know how to translate it. I had to learn how to leave their emotions to them and to just be present and bear witness to their transition. If I absorbed it, if I got too involved, and if I let it become my own, it was really detrimental to my own mental health because I had so many people that I was trying to help. I needed to know when to say, okay, I need to step away. I need to take some time, or I need to pass you off to somebody else. I'm very aware of my scope of practice. And since I am so young and I am, relatively new, I've only been doing this for a few years. It's been quite the learning experience.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a good point. Like you said, death in general is very emotional, whether it's sudden or it's something that's been building for a long time. So yeah, I can definitely see how, especially dealing directly with the person who's going through the transition, it can bring up a lot of your own emotions and your own thoughts. So creating those boundaries are definitely, I think it's hard for anyone in any situation, but I think especially since you're going basically almost daily with someone through one of the biggest changes, it's bound to affect you in some way.
Absolutely, yeah. And, a lot of the people that I work with remind me a lot of myself, and I think to myself, this could be me, or, there's so many parallels here. It really takes a toll on you, and you have to stop and be like, okay, it's not me, but I'm here to help, and I'm making a difference, and I'm able to alleviate some of this tension and some of this pain, right? Mm-hmm. I had a client who, unfortunately, here in my small community, was shot and killed by police a couple years ago, and that was a whole, media nightmare. Everybody was sensationalizing it, and the media wanted the big scoop, and news outlets just wanted to interview the family, and they were Indigenous. And so I looked at them and I saw my family, and I saw, potentially my brother or my husband, on the street or, killed in broad daylight. And it was very, very difficult for me to separate work from the emotions that came up in myself. But in the end, I have a really good mentor who guides me through a lot of things and who takes the time to really explain the deep intricacies of this work to me. And it's thanks to her that I was able to get through it gracefully and to really, do my job and help this family.
So I guess there are other death doulas that you work with, and you mentioned before that you have like mentors. Is this a very tight community that you guys kind of create within yourselves to kind of aid each other?
Absolutely, yeah. I've been very lucky to be a part of this incredible community that Alua Arthur has built with Going with Grace. It's her baby, it's her organization, and from there I've been very welcome into communities with other death doulas. I was talking earlier about a Sacred Passing and a Pearl Collective, who are both run by LaShawna Williams. And, there's such welcoming and warm and passionate communities of people who really want to inspire change and make a difference and to help people. And I feel so lucky to be able to work so closely with such brilliant people with the same drive and passion and desires that I have.
Gotcha. That's really neat. So if you can you kind of go kind of like a step-by-step process on how you would approach, say, someone who was grieving versus someone who was themselves dying? Because I know for a lot of people, they get scared to even think about that process, or like even mention to or talk to each other about what will actually happen when I die, or what's going to happen when I know I'm going to die.
Yeah, so if it's somebody who is given a terminal diagnosis and is facing what we call, active death, one of the pillars of this work is to meet people where they are. So it's not my job to make anyone necessarily more comfortable with the idea of dying. It's not my job to reassure people about what's on the other side. It's not my job to tell people everything's going to be okay in the way that we understand it, It's my job to say, how can I help you feel the most comfortable, the most at peace, and the most safe on this, journey that you're about to take? Because once you get to the final days and final hours, your body instinctually knows what to do, and it's a little scary for people who haven't been around it. But as your body starts to shut down and as what we call the machine of, your brain starts to misfire, human nature and human instinct takes over. From there, I'm just kind of a presence to reassure and to accompany them as they transition, into death and into that last kind of, I can't hear you or talk anymore. And so then I'm very deeply honored to be there for that. But when it's somebody who's grieving either, a recent death or a previous death or whatever kind of grief they have, there it's my job to see, okay, where are you in your grief? How are you processing this? And what's underneath the surface, because a lot of times with grief, you see anger or you see resentment or you see, things like that, the big emotions. And I was always taught that underneath anger is something else. Anger is this big brother emotion that comes in and protects us from the things that we might not want to face. So when you scratch the surface, there's always, fear, there's deep sadness, there's, of course, grief, there's, guilt and fault and all those terrible things. And at that point, it's my job to facilitate the understanding that while, somebody is dead, that doesn't mean that the love that they had for us is gone, There's a saying in our culture that says, your ancestors' blessings are still protecting you. And that's very true, and that's very relevant, because death doesn't take away the memories that we had with someone. Death doesn't take away the feelings. It doesn't take away the emotions. It just takes away the tangible human. And so from there, we kind of just talk about, how they want to go forward, how they want to process their grief, and if they're even, ready to do that with just me, or if they need like a certified grief counselor. And I'm always the first one to recommend therapy for everyone. I think absolutely everyone should be in therapy, whether or not you've had something traumatic happen to you. Therapy's great. So I always work with them and maybe getting them to that space if that's what is necessary.
Yeah, I do I do agree that there seems to be, like, especially going through grief, there's very strong emotions that will always arise, but it seems like underneath, or like kind of the basis of what started those emotions, is always something else. And it's trying to reach that point with people, or even with yourself, is sometimes the hardest thing to do.
Absolutely.
With people who you work with, for instance, who are grieving, what seems to be the biggest barriers for them to process, and what are some ways that someone who perhaps may be starting to grieve or doesn't realize that that's what they're doing, what are some steps that they can do to kind of move forward and try and heal from that?
I think the first step and the most important one is always to just be able to sit with the emotion that arises. Like we talked about earlier, our society is one that really pushes us to ignore our feelings and push through them and to just get it done. And so we've kind of lost touch with what emotions are and what they mean. And also society has this terrible idea that, good emotions are good and bad emotions are bad. And I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think emotions are very similar to the way that we feel hunger. Our body needs fuel, or when we're thirsty, our body needs water. When we're sad, our body, needs to just be sad. And, when we're angry, something else is going on. Or when we're happy, they're just indicators of something going on within us, and they're not necessarily negative or positive. They're just trying to show us the things that are going on inside of us. And so being able to sit with our emotion, recognizing that they're not good or bad, and then understanding, what triggered them, I think is really the first step in being able to sort through grief and unpack that huge suitcase of, whatever's going on.
What are some of the things in your job that kind of surprise you? Are there any instances where either someone's reaction to something is not what you expected, or like once you go through the process, you feel something different than you were expecting to?
Yeah. Every day is a new adventure in grief work and with working with people. People don't really surprise me anymore, because they all come from different places. They all have a different understanding of the world. And, we all have this cultural relativism that makes certain things either taboo or makes them normal to us. And I just really love being able to sit back and listen to people and to really absorb what they're saying from their, different experiences. And, whenever I leave a consultation or a meeting or whatever with someone who is dying or is grieving, I'm always shocked at the overwhelming theme of loneliness that comes up. Everybody just feels so very alone. And it's funny to me because, well, it's not necessarily funny, but it's astounding to me because we as humans developed to be in a society that helped each other and that was there for each other. We developed to live in tribal communities, and we are so far from it, and we wonder why we're all sad. We wonder why we feel isolated and why we feel unprepared for the big eventualities of life. That's just, one of the things, but it surprises me more than anything else.
Yeah. No, and I think especially with this last year, I think a lot of us have either realized how important community and just that sense of belonging with other people, how important that is. Feelings of loneliness seem to have, especially in the last year or so, gotten only stronger because we've had to isolate for so long.
Yeah, definitely. And I've noticed a lot of people are having realizations of the superficial connection that they felt to people, and not necessarily the deep, intimate relationships that they wanted to have. Everyone wants to be understood, and they want to be heard, and they want to be validated. But how do we do that when our society doesn't necessarily allow us to be vulnerable with each other? It doesn't allow us to share, our innermost thoughts for fear of judgment or fear of not being seen as professional or whatever, So that kind of loneliness really hits at the end of life when people think, wow, maybe the relationships I have aren't the ones that I thought I did.
Yeah, there's always that kind of, I guess, theme that sometimes comes up in a lot of media and stuff where you reach the end of your life or you reach a very important part of your life and you see who's actually around you and realize just how strong those connections are. And you'll run into issues where you're relying on people and you realize they may not have been the best person to rely on, or the complete opposite where you didn't rely on really anyone, and then you're kind of left alone and dealing in situations like that. So yeah, it's definitely one of those things where like you kind of sit back, and it seems to be a very common thing for people not only dealing with grief but with any big changes. They realize just how alone they are. I think one of the things that you mentioned was a fear of connecting with people through either being afraid that they're judged. And I think that's one of the biggest things that's stopping true connections with people is this fear of shame or judge, or feeling like if you reach out to someone, they're not going to listen to you. And so that stops so many beautiful connections from happening, and also causes so many connections to break apart so easily, just because you may feel like a strong connection with someone, but something happens and the fear takes over. And so you push away who they are and you push away others who might be trying to help you just because that fear is so strong.
Definitely, yeah. And, fear is it's a huge thing that paralyzes us almost completely. And it's supposed to keep us safe, right? Fear is the thing that kind of triggers our lizard brain into fight or flight, into survival mode. But we cannot consistently exist in just fight or flight survival. It's not sustainable and it's not healthy for anyone. And a lot of Western society has taught us, we have to stay on our toes all the time and we have to be wary of people because there's not good people out there or whatever, they try to peddle to us. And it's just it's so devastating, it's so completely, it just doesn't make any sense. And so of course we feel lonely, of course we feel sad, of course we feel all these things. There's such unnecessary pressure. And I think the pandemic has really put things into perspective as far as like what matters and what doesn't. So I'm in a way sort of thankful for the lessons that we've been taught, and I'm very excited to implement them as my life continues. Hopefully, pandemics won't last forever, that much is clear, and we'll be able to really redefine the way that we live after this moment of break, because we were all kind of forced to stop and think, is this really the way that we want to continue to live, or the way that we want to continue to die? So how fun.
Yeah, I guess that's one positive out of all of this.
Definitely.
So we've talked a little bit about people who are experiencing grief and how to help them out. Is there anything that you would want to share with people who may be in the process of dying or who fear the process of dying, and something that you want to share with them to kind of help them move forward into rethinking and changing the frame of mind towards that?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and I don't ever really know how to answer, because how can I, as someone who has never experienced death, personally say, oh, this is, what you should see, or this is what you should consider? I think that when you're dying, it is the perfect time to take a personal inventory and to really be selfish. We can finally say, this is what I want because I want it and I have a limited amount of time here, or this is how I want to spend my final days, or this is what I want my legacy or my, final thoughts to be. And we're so preoccupied with this fear of what's it going to feel like, what's going to happen, how will my family react, that we don't trust enough in the human body, and we don't trust enough in our innate ability to do these things and to do it well and to do it beautifully. I know that, a beautiful death is kind of a contradiction, but I truly believe that if we allow the natural process to happen And that if we are just kind of thankful, for the experiences that we were allowed to have, things would be a lot better and there wouldn't be quite so much resistance, and maybe there wouldn't be so much discomfort in the end. Because I do feel like people who have the most resistance to dying and the most fear hold on far past what they should. And it's so painful to watch, and it must be painful to experience.
Are there any other final words or kind of things that you want to leave people with? I know that the process of dying is very unique for everyone, but it seems like everyone can maybe benefit from like a change of a mind every now and then.
Yeah. Some final words, I think always, don't be afraid of death. It's coming for you, no matter what. Future science is not gonna it's not gonna save us quite yet. But yeah, don't be afraid of it, and don't be afraid to live a life in which you are the main character. We tend to do a lot for other people, and I think that's wonderful. But oftentimes, a lot of the regrets that I have for my clients and a lot of the regrets that I hear are, I didn't do enough for myself, or I wanted to do this and I wanted to do that, and I didn't prepare because I was scared. So, a lesson from the ancestors and a lesson from the now dead would always be, live a life that at the end of the day you feel satisfied with, that is full of joy, and that is full of vibrancy, and be aware, plan. Unfortunately, in America and the West, death is such a bureaucratic process and full of a bunch of, hoops to jump through and just terrible. Be prepared and know your options. There's so many beautiful options for body disposition, green options, natural options, as well as, the traditional, funeral industry options, and just get comfortable with how you might want, your body to be left to your family.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you for coming on and talking with us. This has been very informative and a good way to kind of rethink what death is.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. If people want to find you either through social media or otherwise, how can they do so?
Yeah, so on Instagram, I am doula_damn_thing. And on, I have a website, Doula Damn Thing Today. And on Facebook, I am at Lupe the Death Doula. And I post, I'm getting better about posting. I often think that people don't necessarily want to hear about it, but I'm getting better. So find me there, please. I have a bunch of resources and a bunch of cool stuff. And also please check out the Pearl Collective and A Sacred Passing if you're here in Washington State. Even if you're not, check us out. We do a lot of cool stuff and a lot of community outreach.
Awesome. Yeah, those are some great resources. Well, thank you again for coming on and kind of introducing us all to what it is that you do and see every day. Because I know eventually we will all get there ourselves.
Oh yeah, it's coming.
Thank you all for stopping by. If you like hearing all of these incredible stories, please consider supporting us through Anchor and like, rate, and subscribe. If you want to reach out and share your own stories, feel free to email us at storiesattheofrenda@gmail.com. And you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at storiesattheofrenda. Be safe out there, and we'll see you all soon. Te quiero.